Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our monthly Future Freedom Foundation webinar. Tonight's topic is work, and I think that it's safe to say that for probably forever, Americans, and I put libertarians in this category too, have sort of a love-hate relationship with work. Just to show you the range. I'll quote first Ralph Waldo Emerson, a famous, of course, American author and intellectual, who wrote in his essay, The American Scholar, in 1837, the following: "I hear, therefore, with joy whatever is beginning to be said of the dignity and necessity of labor to every citizen. There is virtue yet in the hoe and the spade, for the learned as well as for the unlearned hands, and labor is everywhere welcome. Always we are invited to work." And on the other extreme, we have the word, and I should say word, literally one word, by the great American philosopher who some of you may know, Maynard G. Krebs, from the old program, The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis. And for this, I will have to show you a YouTube video. I hope this is going to work. Okay, did everybody see that? Nod your head if you saw the great. Anybody here remember the old Dobie Gillis show? Anybody as old as I am here? I don't know if it's in reruns, but they had that great beatnik character who later on became stranded on in that terrible boating accident. Got stranded after a 3-hour tour of Gilligan. But first he was Maynard G. Krebs, and anytime the word work was said around him, he would say work. He had a natural reflex against it. So that's the span, right? We have people saying work is the path to dignity, and we should, love work all the time. And then we have in us also this idea of work. I got to work. I'd rather, engage in leisure. So, we rhapsodize about labor like Emerson did. But in our personal lives, we love labor-saving devices. And we don't like unnecessary work. We don't like make-work schemes in our personal lives, although some people don't mind them when it comes to public policy, make work. Emerson and other pillars of American culture, whom for these purposes I will call the moralists, associated work with dignity and purpose. Historian Thaddeus Russell teaches us that when the slaves were freed from the southern plantations, they were pounded with the gospel of work from Northerners, from abolitionists, and from people who ran the Freedmen's Bureau.
Testing 1 2 3 4.
Okay, I heard that, but I thought I muted everybody.
I'm sorry, I thought we were supposed to be muted, and I was testing my mic.
Oh, I have it on mute all, so I don't know even how I'm able to hear you. But anyway, we'll press along here. So Thaddeus Russell, historian, teaches us that when the slaves were freed from the southern plantations, they were indoctrinated, pounded really with this idea of the gospel of work, that the duty was to work basically all the time. Russell writes, slaves generally considered work to be only a means to wealth, but after emancipation, Americans told them to work, even thankless. They told them that work, even thankless, non-remunerative work, was a virtue in itself. He writes this in a great book, by the way, A Renegade History of the United States. I recommend that. Russell reports that the Freedmen's Bureau admonished the former slaves, quote, "You must be industrious and frugal. It is feared that some will act from the mistaken notion that freedom means liberty to be idle. This class of persons, known to the law as vagrants, must at once correct this mistake," close quote. Russell notes that, quote, "thousands of black men were rounded up for refusing to work." This is when the southern states started passing black codes, which include vagrancy laws, so that anybody who appeared to be idle could be scooped up and fined. And then if you couldn't pay the fine, and often people couldn't pay the fine, they were then rented out to private employers to work. The idea being work was good. Work was good. The message was that work was not just an honest and proper way to obtain the necessities of life without mooching off others. The activity in itself is a source of goodness, even saintliness, and should be engaged in unceasingly, taking time out only for eating, sleeping, other bodily functions, and tending to one's familial duties. One didn't work to live, one lived to work. Whites had been subjected to the same harangue for ages. Work was a reward in itself, apart from the payment, because, quote, idle hands are the devil's playground. Now, we must be clear that the message was not merely that work would be a source of satisfaction. Apart from the money, the message amounted to a vilification of leisure, indeed of consumption. In a good illustration of the bootleggers and Baptist phenomenon, the moralists were joined in their labor evangelism by employers who needed uncomplaining workers willing to spend long hours in unpleasant factories. People preferred leisure and looked for every opportunity to indulge in it. Hence, the informal institution in early America known as Saint Monday. That's when people not only took Sunday off, but they didn't show up for work on Monday, which, as Russell notes, Benjamin Franklin sneered at because it, as Franklin put it, it is a duty kept by our working people as Sunday. The only difference is that instead of employing their time cheaply in church, they are wasting it expensively in the alehouse. We get a different picture of labor from the economists, however. The classical economists and the Austrians, at least from Ludwig von Mises onward, stressed the unpleasantness, the disutility, and even sad necessity of labor. Adam Smith and other early economists equated work with toil, which is not a word overflowing with positive connotations. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith wrote, "The real price of everything, what everything really costs to the man who wants to acquire it, is the toil and trouble of acquiring it. What everything is really worth to the man who has acquired it and who wants to dispose of it or exchange it for something else is the toil and trouble which it can save to himself and which it can impose upon other people. What is bought with money or with goods is purchased by labor as much as what we acquire by the toil of our own body. That money or those goods indeed save us this toil." Frederick Bastiat carried on this tradition by emphasizing that exchange arises out of a wish to be spared labor. One accepts the terms of an exchange only if obtaining the desired good in other ways would be more arduous. For Bastiat and other early economists, exchange was the foundation of society. As the French economist Destutt de Tracy wrote, "Society is purely and solely a continual series of exchanges." It follows that the penchant for economizing effort, the preference for leisure, is a beneficent feature of human nature. Somewhere in the science fiction writer Robert Heinlein has a character say that the wheelbarrow must have been invented by a lazy person who didn't want to have to push or carry heavy loads up from one level to another. So he discovered the wheelbarrow as a way to save himself work. Further, Bastiat explained, technological advancement is valued precisely because it substitutes the free services of nature for human toil. In his uncompleted magnum opus, Economic Harmonies, he wrote, "It is characteristic of progress, and indeed this is what we mean by progress, to transform onerous utility into gratuitous utility, to decrease exchange value without decreasing utility, and to enable all men for fewer pains or at smaller cost to obtain the same satisfactions." By onerous utility, Bastiat meant utility bought with sweat and strain. By gratuitous utility, he meant utility provided by nature free of charge. When ingenuity is applied to the making of a good, Bastiat said, quote, "its production has in large measure been turned over to nature. It is obtained for less expenditure of human effort. Less service is performed as it passes from hand to hand." Needless to say, this is a good thing because it requires less exertion. Of course, some of the freed up time will be devoted to producing other goods, so there's not really a decrease in labor that were unaffordable yesterday, but some will be devoted to consumption or leisure. The proportion set aside for leisure will likely increase as living standards rise, assuming government interference doesn't deny workers their rewards for higher productivity. The goal of all men in their activities, this is Bastiat, the goal of all men in their activities is to reduce the amount of effort in relation to the end desired, and in order to accomplish this end, to incorporate in their labor a constantly increasing proportion of the forces of nature. They invent tools or machines. They enlist the chemical and mechanical forces of the elements. They divide their labors. They unite their efforts. How to do more with less is the eternal question asked in all times, in all places, in all situations, in all things. He elaborates on this interesting point in a remarkable chapter in Economic Harmonies, Chapter 8, which is called Private Property and Commonwealth. I think I'm going to do a webinar on that chapter in the coming months. Bastiat agreed with Smith, Adam Smith, who wrote, quote, "Consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production," close quote. Hence, the economists rejected the moralist view that production, effort, work is an end in itself. We see this same lack of enthusiasm for work in John Stuart Mill, an influential classical economist as well as a philosopher. In 1849, Thomas Carlyle published an article lamenting that the end of slavery in Great Britain meant that white people couldn't make sure that blacks worked enough, namely for whites. This is an article called Occasional Discourse on the Negro Question. It was in Fraser's Magazine for Town and Country in December 1849. This, by the way, is why Carlyle dubbed economics, which was premised on free labor, the dismal science. People think the term dismal science comes from Malthus's pessimism about population outstripping food production and therefore leading to disease and mass death. But that is not true. As David Levy, the economist from George Mason University, has written, the dismal science was a label for the market economy that was given by Carlyle, who was an old world conservative type, non-liberal, anti-liberal, who thought that free labor meant that blacks would not be working enough, and by that he meant working enough for white people. So Mill wrote an anonymous response to Carlyle called "The Negro Question" in the same magazine the month following. He protested Carlyle's suggestion that blacks were meant to serve white people. Then, and I've written about this previously, then Mill turned to what, quote, the gospel of work, which was praised by Carlyle, and I'm quoting Mill now, which to my mind justly deserves the name of a cant. That's the word C-A-N-T, close quote. Mill attacked the idea that work is an end in itself rather than merely a means. Quote, "While we talk only of work and not of its object, we are far from the root of the matter. Or, if it may be called the root, it is the root without flower or fruit. In opposition to the gospel of work, I would assert the gospel of leisure," Mill said, "and maintain that human beings cannot rise to the finer attributes of their nature compatibly with a life filled with labor. The exhausting, stiffening, stupefying toil of many kinds of agricultural and manufacturing laborers. To reduce very greatly the quantity of work required to carry on existence is as needful as to distribute it more equally, and the progress of science and the increasing ascendancy of justice and good sense tend to this result." So his point was that if you're working all the time, you can't really rise to the noble things in life, arts, reading, other sort of activities. If you're stuck in a factory most of the day or out in the fields most of the day, that was not something to be praised. That was something that you hope will be got, a phase that will be gotten past quickly through technology and other things. So let's turn to the Austrians now. In Mises and in Murray Rothbard, we find very similar views. Work is to be economized. If it's so great, well, we wouldn't economize on it, would we? We'd want to do as much as we could. Mises devotes an entire chapter in his book Socialism to refuting the state socialist claim that work is unpleasant only because of the market economy, and that it would be blissful if private property were abolished and the market were replaced with state central planning. Under any system, Mises wrote, labor may afford a small and, he thought, insignificant measure of direct satisfaction, but that soon passes. Yet people keep working to obtain its indirect satisfactions, the goods it enables them to buy. Mises may overstate his case here. I mean, there may be more satisfaction, direct satisfaction from some of the work we do than Mises seemed to indicate. But his mentor, Karl Menger, actually overstated in the other direction. I mean, look at what Menger writes in 1871. The occupations of by far the great majority of men afford enjoyment, and thus themselves true satisfaction of needs, and would be practiced, although perhaps in smaller measure or in modified measure, in a modified manner, even if men were not forced by lack of means to exert their powers. I find it hard to believe that most of the work done in 1871 was stuff people really liked doing and would be doing it even if they weren't paid for it. Mises mocked the state socialists by putting scare quotes around the words joy of labor in his book Socialism, asking, quote, if work gives satisfaction per se, why is the worker paid? Why does he not reward the employer for the pleasure which the employer gives him by allowing him to work? What people often take for the joy of labor, Mises said, was actually the satisfaction of finishing a task, the, quote, pleasure in being free of work, rather than pleasure in the work itself. Mises quotes the medieval monks who appended to the manuscript copies that they had just painstakingly produced by hand the following Latin phrase. Pardon my Latin pronunciation if anybody catches that I'm doing it wrong. Laus tibi sit Christi quoniam liber explicit iste, which Mises translates sort of inexactly as praise the Lord because the work is completed. This is what the monks would write at the end of their handwritten copies of various manuscripts. So they were glad to have the work behind them. For Rothbard, leisure is, quote, a desirable good, close quote, a consumer good, which people will forgo only if at the margin the fruits of a unit of labor undertaken are preferred to the satisfaction that a unit of leisure would afford. Rothbard acknowledged that labor can be satisfying, and he wrote, quote, in cases where the labor itself provides positive satisfactions, however, these are intertwined with and cannot be separated from the prospect of obtaining the final product. Deprived of the final product, man will consider his labor senseless and useless, and the labor itself will no longer bring positive satisfactions. Those activities which are engaged in purely for their own sake are not labor, but are pure play, consumers' goods in themselves. Play as a consumer's good is subject to the law of marginal utility, as are all goods, and the time spent in play will be balanced against the utility to be derived from other obtainable goods. In the expenditure of any hour of labor, therefore, man weighs the disutility of the labor involved, including the leisure foregone plus any dissatisfaction stemming from the work itself, against the utility of the contribution he will make in that hour to the production of desired goods, including future goods and any pleasure in the work itself. That is, with the value of his marginal product. So Rothbard's mentor Mises made a fundamental point about human action when he wrote, even if labor were a pure pleasure, it would have to be used economically since human life is limited in time and human energy is not exhaustible. That being the case, I will reserve further thoughts on work for another time and certainly for our conversation here. Meanwhile, I'll just close with the words, Laus tibi sit Christi quoniam liber explicit iste. I now will unmute, and we can commence with the conversation. So who'd like to plunge in? Hello, Joel.
Oh, hey. Yeah. I found out about this like 10 minutes ago.
Well, you didn't miss too much.
Yeah, it's like I basically just sent an email, asking you to let it in. Yeah.
So, does anybody want to launch the conversation here?
Yeah. So I think when you're talking about Rothbard's ideas about work as a useful good and all that kind of stuff, and the idea that work is less desirable when people don't retain the product of their labor. It sort of reminded me of William Morris, who is a sort of utopian socialist thinker, who talked about useless toil versus labor. And he had these sort of three hopes about labor, and one of the hopes is about that when you labor, you'll actually get what you want out of it. The other one being that you'll actually enjoy the work itself. And there's another hope besides that, but it's an interesting essay about what makes work actually worth doing, or what differentiates a lot of the stuff that goes on in the modern economy, as opposed to what I think a lot of libertarians would be advocating. So I thought that was relevant.
Yeah,
Okay.
Like he has the best arguments for work and the best arguments against that.
Ah, is this stuff online?
Yeah, you can even find. I have a website. It's called abolishwork.com, and Sheldon's familiar with it. And I put up excerpts of William Morris's "Useless Toil versus Labor." I think it's called that. And so I just basically highlight the three hopes, because like the rest of the essay is just kind of about how great communism is and stuff like that, which I'm not really interested in. But you know, I do like the parts about work.
What's the name? What's the name of the website again?
Oh, it's called abolishwork.com.
Oh, abolishwork.com. Okay. And so, what are his dates roughly? Is he what century? Is he modern?
Oh, geez, I think William Morris was 19th, 20th century.
I think he was. Well, he was writing like the 1880s or so, because he was actually writing in part as a direct response to Looking Backward by Bellamy.
Oh yeah, really.
And he kind of saw the rise of, like, he was seeing the drifting of socialism kind of in that direction.
Okay, interesting.
And
yeah, I've been to the abolishwork.com site, but I'm not sure I read him, so I will make it a point to do that.
Yeah.
Because I would like to read more about this.
Yeah, and his stuff is all on Marxist.org too.
I mean,
that's where I got it. That's where I got it from. I just got it from Marxist.org, and I just put it on the website.
There are a lot of senses to that word work, which we tend to just all bundle together without separating the different strands. So it's useful to do that. I mean, we use it in a sort of a positive sense, like, oh, I really like my work, or I appreciate your work. You might say to an artist or an actor. On the other hand, I got to go to work today, and so we think of work as toil, as Smith used it. Toil and trouble.
Yeah.
Or as Bastiat used it.
Yeah, and the thing is that Morris, like, one of his criticisms of the Bellamy socialism was that they were too pro-work and too against it at the same time. That they had this idea, like when there was that piece that Nick was trying to write a response to about people working in their quote-unquote prime years, how great it was at the French show. They have all these vacations, but at least in their peak physical years, they're having a job, and it's like the Americans are lazy. And it kind of reminded me of Morris's critique of Bellamy, of like that you would have to work kind of between like 20 and 45. It's like you'd have to start working at 20, and then like at 23 you'd have to decide on specialization, and you just have to work at that. And then at 45 you would just have to stop working. And he said, like if you were doing any sort of work you would actually be wanting to do, you just would not want to stop working at some sort of uniform time and just completely change your habits.
Bellamy's book is a fascinating book because he really took seriously the idea that you could totally design a society.
Yeah.
I read it closely when I was writing my book, Tethered Citizens, and I discussed it in that. It's really pretty interesting to see a guy sit down and say, okay, I'm going to design society. He would have he would have all these live orchestras, because all musicians would be guaranteed work in an orchestra. So there'd be lots of them, and everybody would have, you didn't have the idea of electronics, but everybody would have sort of pipes coming into their house that they could put up to their ears and hear live orchestras. There'd be live orchestras all the time, 24 hours a day, because they would.
And that no amateurs would ever sing. Like that, there's this one point he says, like his girlfriend is gonna. Probably said, are you going to sing me? And she just laughs, like, why would I sing when a professional can do it better? It's just kind of unalloyed, this kind of just unalloyed, and unlike consumerism. And the ironic thing is it's also very pro-consumerist, that it's like that it has like sort of people's Walmarts. where it's like that the actual distribution of goods, sound very much like a big box store that would be done by sort of central planning.
Yeah.
And, that it was before the left kind of had such a bad track record at actually producing consumer goods that it started to think that there's a lot of sour grapes in the left anti-consumerism. Like if the left anti-consumerism, had the Pintos and the Soviet Union had the iPhones, they wouldn't be saying how, degrading consumerism is, and how,
He launched a movement with this book, right? There were clubs all over the country. He called us, I think his idea is the new nationalism. His ideology, I think, it was nationalistic. Getting some background noise.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it was called the new nationalism. And
yeah.
Go ahead.
And the new nationalism actually knew that. Like.
And then another tidbit is his cousin, he was Edward Bellamy. His cousin Francis Bellamy was a Christian socialist. He wrote the Pledge of Allegiance. That's right. And in the 20s, you can find the pictures of kids from the 20s giving the Nazi salute, because it wasn't a Nazi salute yet.
Wasn't he also a flag salesman?
Was he what?
Wasn't he also a flag salesman?
Oh, I'm not sure about that. So you're saying he had an economic interest as well?
Yeah, it's quite conflicting in his case.
The other utopian socialist was King Gillette, the guy who invented the Gillette razor.
Oh, really?
And the guy who actually invented the strategy of selling the razors and not selling the blades and not the shavers.
Yeah.
And Roger T. Long said that because he had this book called The Human Drift, where it was even more planned, where there would be this one gigantic city that was next to Niagara Falls, I think, because the most efficient way to get electricity to be put one enormous generator near the largest waterfall, and it's like Roger T. Long, it says, like, if someone combines everything, it's like Hayek's worst nightmares combined with Kevin Carson's worst nightmare. Yeah.
There's another.
I'm kind of curious about where you think about the nature of work now, and that our workforce participation is pretty low at a relatively young age, and we're running around 90,000 below. Is there something structurally going on in the economy, and reflecting back on what you've been reading, that suggests that something is materially different about the economy today than from what you've read about in the past?
Well, what I'd say to that is, I think with time, the sort of the rot of corporatism is just maturing and taking more and more toll. That's what it seems to me. The Tyler Cowen has said the last couple of recessions have been, the recoveries have been, if you want to call them recoveries, have been increasingly more jobless as we go along. I just think that's the result of.
But yet consumption, as what you guys were mentioning earlier, remains still. People want consumption, but they don't want labor. I'm having a hard time reconciling that a bit. And at some point, there's going to be more people available to consume than are working. Correct?
I think it's more a matter of corporations wanting consumption and not wanting labor.
Yeah, you think that the more efficient production gets, the less, the more consumption per, production ratio would increase.
Right.
Like there is this quote by one of those kind of Soviet tailorists, like the one of those Soviet guys that wanted to kind of hyper, like the Taylor is scientific management.
Yeah.
His name was not Taylor Swift.
No, Frederick Winslow Taylor.
Yeah, it's like but it was one of those Soviet guys who was trying to do that sort of system. The whole point is that if we really make production efficient, we can take those 8 hours a day to produce, like if we're producing nails or whatever. Instead of taking 8 hours, we can quote unquote 2 or 3 hours. Not right now.
Yep.
Yeah. Which is fun.
Well, if we're not working, then we're free up to do something else, and that's going to be some kind of leisure activity, right? So
This is Mark.
That's still consumption of activity.
In response to the original question, it had something to part of it had to do with young people in labor, and I believe that can be largely attributed to what some people call the childification of the world, where there are social pressures, including state integrated social pressures for young people to do other things than work. And you can understand how that works because unions don't want competition from really young people. And
does anybody notice, and if older people would probably, I mean, young and old need to come in on this, but the different attitude that people have today, young people have, compared to what the attitudes that were prevalent in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and 80s would have been the time that I was working in the corporate world myself. And back then, I don't think that I bought into it as a worker, but the corporate world really expected people to be loyal to their company. And that was very important. I don't see that anymore. I don't see it in my children.
And they kind of talk the talk. They kind of, pay lip service to, giving your all, and...
Well, is there less of that now, though? Is that what you're saying, or not?
They still give this kind of lip service that, everyone's working hard and everyone's giving their all, like, no one is, and everyone is kind of goofing off. And,
Dilbert, it's like Dilbert.
I think that changed with job market forces. If you read Megatrends, this is back around 90, 95, predicted that we were coming to a society much like we have now, where people have jobs for 3 to 5 to 10 years instead of 30 to 40 years.
Yeah.
And this was because the corporations themselves were not committed to these people, and because high-tech concerns lend themselves to people moving from job to job as their skills are more needed in one place or another.
And it was in that whole era of like the kind of mid-century, General Motors, of like a few kind of corporations, which is very large cloud over the economy that could kind of, be there around for decades, and that they could have these kind of very stable, like just the classic like mid-century auto industry. Like that was just a very weird situation.
Because Germany and Japan had been destroyed in the war, and the U.S. was really the only industrial power standing. Right, it had kind of a monopoly as a result for a while.
One has to wonder if the FDR era created a false corporate town intensified a false corporate town environment or corporate belonging environment that isn't natural in the market, that people naturally would move around with their skills and services and products, and that what we saw in that part of the 20th century was actually unnatural. Or maybe it was a phase.
Mine started a little bit later. For one thing, you get health insurance related to your employer coming in during the war, and so that became an institution, and that gave you a disincentive to leave your job, because maybe you have some condition and you wouldn't get immediately covered at a new job. People didn't have portable insurance, so that was one thing that created job lock.
I guess I was thinking about market fixing that the government was in many times much more involved in than it is now. Like the airline industry, for example. They had it all fixed out to what corporations had what routes and all that, and it was the same way in a lot of technologies. And I think when that loosened up, that's what caused the mobility of the jobs and so on.
I think I recall what Solzhenitsyn said in a book called The Gulag, where he says, nothing destroys a man more quickly than the performance of completely irrational work. And that we're just not engaged. We can't do that. And at some point, you can do it when you're younger. When I was drafted in the military, I actually took it seriously. I wouldn't do that as an adult. And I think as things have matured, we're not really going to buy into some of the corporate shtick that you could have gotten away a few years ago, kind of but not as much now. I think those days, I think it's kind of gone.
And people just know that they're not, that if they pay in, they're not going to have that lifetime job at GM or whatever.
Right. So does that speak towards the desire towards autonomy, more like the professions, so that we have a lot of independently employed workers?
Well, there's more of that. The technology is making that more possible. There's more people working at home, I'm sure, because of computers. And
how about the so-called democratization of information? We know more than we knew as a populace. We know what's going on because we have all these different ways to learn about it.
Yeah.
Well, that's right, and that's, I've seen that a lot. I happen to be an RN, and in medicine is probably the only industry that has actually had the productivity has actually gotten worse. We're less efficient now than we were 20 years ago in terms of.
Well, actually, there was this graph in the New York Times front page of all places that showed the cost adjusted for inflation of just the average cost of goods over time in different fields, and it was like a graph like this, where consumer electronics was just a straight line, straight down, and kind of the more kind of gadget type goods were kind of going steadily down, and then healthcare, and then like shooting straight up was higher education. That even as dysfunctional as healthcare is, and how the costs are skyrocketing, that it's just, like that it does, it pales in comparison to just the sheer inflation of college.
And I look at that, and I always say that, of course, when you separate the payer from the beneficiary, right, the receiver of the good does not pay for the good. That happens.
You could more or less, as a libertarian, predict where that would be, and you could look at it, education and so on. There's absolutely no really market controls on those anymore.
Right, and it's been pointed out a lot that that even within the general, someone get the phone, even within the
that's not, no, it's still going on.
Somebody get that, maybe for me. It's been pointed out that even within the general category of medical care, LASIK surgery and cosmetic surgery have fallen quite a bit in price as they become more innovative, because insurance doesn't typically pay for that stuff. I guess doesn't pay for
the price mechanism actually exists.
Oh, exactly. It exists there, and you see it.
Even with licensing and the other kinds of interventions that exist, you still see price competition because people are paying their own money, and therefore they shop carefully. So I think it's a good illustration.
Yeah, and a lot of people just cannot wrap their heads around, they think that there's just something about medicine that is just either inherently very complex or inherently requires just people with very high amounts of training, or that people who need it will just never be able, that the real cost will just always be less than what poor people can afford. They just think there's just something about medicine that makes it just different. That they just think it's not like, buying toothpaste or whatever. It kind of has this air of mystery around it.
Yeah. I'd suggest that there is one thing different about medical care, and that is that everyone feels or almost everyone feels an innate need to live forever. That is, at the time they're dying, they want to live some more. There's very few other things that are really that. You could do without a home for a certain period of time if you have to. You could do without food or find food in this society if you have to. But medical care? Nope. So that's one way that it is different. Now, I wouldn't suggest that the remedy is managing it from hierarchically. But that's one thing that's very different in my mind about medical care.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of a perfectly inelastic demand function that, within weeks of dying. But what I've discovered is that when people empirically talk about it, there is a slope. People do make trade-off decisions, except for when they don't bear the full price of it. and then that's what we get when the government gets involved.
Right, and that's
so. Speaking about work, I wanted to point to the phenomenon that some activity could be entirely enjoyable if you're doing it on your own, but suddenly put it in an employment environment where someone else is giving you deadlines and telling you what time you have to be at the desk, what time you can leave. Suddenly that task, which you might have enjoyed on its own, almost the nature of it changes when it suddenly you're answerable to somebody else. So isn't that part of this idea of the meaning of work, at least the negative side of the meaning? That it's identified with people making demands on us.
Yeah. And does it make a difference? But then people will say, but if it's not your boss making demands on you, it will just be the customer. That if you're self-employed, then it's just the customer making all those demands. Or if you're in a kind of self-managed workplace, it's your coworkers. Yeah. You know, if you're kind of the classic syndicalist thing, then it's your fellow workers, and you know.
Well,
but maybe that's subjectively perceived differently from being a boss, because if it's a customer, one customer can quote fire you, meaning not buy your stuff, but you can find other customers. But if your boss fires you, now you've got to go out and find another boss. So I wonder whether it's different feels different subjectively. You're right. If you're selling something in the market, yes, somebody's going to be making demands on you because you want people to buy it. But it's not the same as the guy or the woman who's saying be at your desk at 8 o'clock in the morning and you can't leave until 4 or 5. Suddenly it seems like toil. What's going on?
Go to the bathroom here, or what's?
Yeah.
Anyway, I wanted to throw that out for just a.
I've come to think of work over the years as something that I'm obligated, whether morally or not morally, or through actual need, to do, even though I don't necessarily want to. Obviously, most of us wouldn't consider it work if we were having fun all day and getting paid. But nobody has fun all day perpetually, no matter what it is they want to do. There's always some point at which you don't want to do it. Yeah. But then, if it's work, you got to do it anyway, unless you want to change your parameters of, you quit or whatever, right? Or choose something else to do instead of whatever it is you need to do, if it works out. Like
Kevin Carson sometimes paints this really nice picture. I mean, I certainly enjoy reading it, of where productivity technology is doing so much, and so much stuff is free as a result of technology. I mean, think of open source software and things like that. That the typical person could work, but I think he says like 15 hours a week, and have a really decent standard of living, and basically work when you want, and when you don't feel like it, you don't have to. And you could be self-employed or be working in some sort of worker-owned co-op or something like that, or maybe just a small partnership with a buddy and working in a garage somewhere. That sounds like a pretty good life to me. I mean, I hope he's right about that.
It sounds a little fantastical. As an engineer, I'd like to have that job.
Well, but there's indications, though, even in our own time. I mean, if you read the book by what's his name, Michael Cox and Richard Alm, Myths of Rich and Poor, which came out in 1999, where they compared work time. They didn't look at prices over time, because then you have a problem with inflation and you have to make all these adjustments. They looked at work time for the average manufacturing, non-supervisory manufacturing employee. And they looked at how much work they had to do to buy a whole raft of things. And they have these charts showing the differences, 1900, 1950, to 1970, to 1999. And just to take an example that I happen to remember, in 1900, it took that person 11. I converted this to quarter hours just to make the comparison easy for everyone to see. I use it in lectures. It took a person to buy a 3-pound chicken 11 quarter hours of work. And in 1999, so almost about 100 years later, it took less than 1 quarter hour. So to put it in Bastiat's terms, that chicken now, since you're only paying 1/4 hour rather than 11/4 hours, a lot of the utility, that chicken is now free, or you're getting it for free because technology.
So I'm interested in what kind of Clay Shirky has talked about this notion of cognitive surplus. That which where people like we're doing right now, engaging in activity that is not work, you're not sleeping, you're still contributing. And it strikes me that I'm sensing there's a lot more of that going on. This cognitive surplus is really outside of the GDP numbers, right? It's a conversation that's going on. People are contributing freely their services, their knowledge, their expertise. And that's not I don't know, this isn't necessarily work, but it is producing utility. Right?
I think going back to the different sort of ways that we can look at work requires like teasing out the different types of work, like Sheldon mentioned before. So there's a few essays that I think about when I'm trying to define work. So one of the essays I look at is the essay by Bob Black, which is called The Abolition of Work, and he basically calls work, or he relies on the definition of sort of activity that is required by either the carrot or the stick, kind of either political or economic manipulations requiring people to be in certain situations. I think there's a better sort of way to go about it, though, which is to look at like different types of labor. So there's this sort of post-Marxist named Andre Gores, who has this chapter in one of his books called The Crisis of Work, and he talks about 3 different types of work or labor or whatever you want to call it. So one of them is called work for economic ends. So it's like, when you're in a shitty sort of minimum wage job and you're just, doing it to get by and whatever. Not a lot of people like that, although some people can deal with it. And then the other one is sort of your middle of the way. It's stuff you do, you have to do to survive, like child rearing or washing the dishes or something. It can be menial or it can be really necessary for life, but it's just a necessary thing. You're not really compelled into it. And then the third category is what he calls autonomous activity, which is activity that's freely chosen. It's not made through mechanisms of a given system. You're just able to engage in this activity, and you're able to choose it. You're not forced against it in some sort of way. So I think those are interesting ways to look at it as well. So we're not tripping over ourselves when we talk about work. Because like some people, like Oscar Wilde in The Soul of Man Under Socialism, says, well, work is just activity of any kind. So at that point, saying you don't like work is like tantamount to wanting everyone to be like, Mr. Lazy from the Mr. Men series back in the 70s or whatever, just basically doing nothing all day. Mm-hmm. But I don't really think that's necessarily what anti-work people are talking about. So yeah, so it's kind of.
I was the one who showed him that.
Yes. Joel was the one who showed me the Mr. Lazy, Mr. Men series.
I guess an accomplishment.
I'm not aware of Mr. I haven't heard of Mr. Lazy. I haven't heard of Mr. Lazy. He's new to me.
I guess to be work, it would have to be either productive or paid or compelled. One of those.
Yeah, that's another way to look at it. But yeah, Mr. Lazy is just from this British cartoon show in the 70s. It's called like the Mr. Men series or something like that. Joel knows more about it than I do.
Yeah, it's like, remember those books where it was like Mr. whatever or Mrs. whatever would be just some person that just had one quality? And then there's the one, like I remember there were these little books that were like this big.
Yeah.
And I had no idea they ever did animated versions. And the thing is that Mr. Lazy, it's this land where just, everyone sleeps all day and just is the bare minimum. But the houses look really nice. I mean, the trees are kind of drooping because they're too lazy to stand up. And they just look like houses.
Lazy trees.
I wanted to mention the anti-work side of American culture. We can find a lot of things that illustrate this. Two of the biggest hit singles, as I heard Carl Hess tell me this once, and Carl Hess was sort of a good anti-work guy. Two of the biggest hit singles of all time were and the people my age will remember this, the 1950s, Tennessee Ernie Ford did the song 16 Tons,
16 tons,
about the guy, I owe my soul to the company store. Great song, sold like I don't know how many copies. And then later, Take This Job and Shove It by, who was it, Johnny Paycheck. That also sold a fantastic amount of records. If you look at TV shows like Sergeant Bilko, remember the Sergeant Bilko show? Now, he was in the Army, but that whole thing was based on shirking work, right? They had always had their schemes, their card games, the gambling. They had a front that they were doing their stuff. This was peacetime between after the Korean War and before the Vietnam War, some fort in Kansas, right? Leavenworth, I guess. And the whole deal was how to make sure we don't get out of doing any work, and let's make this as much fun as possible. And there are a lot of other programs that do the same thing. So
that's
there is
not
this
unusual in a bureaucracy.
Strain. Randall, not hearing you, Randall.
Randall, your thing's off.
Your mic is off.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Remember George Jetson? He went to work and he just pushed one button with a finger. That's all he did at work.
Well, that was trying.
Case on the desk.
And they were trying to show us there that a modern technological society, all work would be just mind-numbing because all you'd be doing is.
Yeah, 3 hours a day.
Right.
I didn't think it looked that bad. I don't know. See,
Maybe it's all relative.
They didn't have the internet for him to shop and browse.
Another thing I can think of is a show. In fact, I was just chatting online with some people about this. I don't know how many people remember the Broadway show was made into a movie, but it probably early 60s maybe. How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying. Find that video if you can. It may not never made it onto DVD. It probably just got stuck in tape. But maybe
Rock Hudson.
No. It was with it's a musical. It was originally on Broadway. Robert Morse was the star.
Right.
And the whole idea was, here's a guy who goes to work in a big company. I don't even know what it does. I don't even know if they tell you what it does. It may not. Big corporation. He goes to work in the mailroom as like a lowly clerk, and just by brown nosing and glad handing, he makes it to the top. He does a little detective work to find out what college various department heads went to, so he can kind of drop that he went there, and he suddenly becomes way at the top. And there's great songs and stories just illustrating that this is what goes on in companies. I don't recall anybody getting offended. I never heard that anybody was offended by this show.
Yeah.
I think people generally believe that's how it works in big companies.
Yeah. 9 to 5.
Yeah.
Both the song and the movie.
There's a related philosophy of fake it till you make it.
Right.
You're supposed to lie on your resume and then figure out how you're going to do the job when you get there. Now, I can't even go anywhere near that, but that sounds kind of related.
Actually, yeah. Well, people say that if you don't like your work, then if you fake it, you will like your job eventually. So. Yeah.
Well, in a bureaucracy, and this comes back to that whole idea of the 7 levels of hell or something like that, and the idea that the worst hell is the one where you've got to do a whole bunch of work, but you're not actually empowered to accomplish the work. And I think that's why you see the Sergeant Bilko idea in the bureaucracies, because we got to have fun at this not getting anything done thing. So.
Well, that's what's fascinating me about this recession in particular, is that it strikes me there is a fundamental, change in the nature of the relationship between employees and their work, as we discussed earlier. That kind of loyalty thing is gone, but also there's the shrinkage of the labor market in the white collar area. These are jobs, and I spent about 20 years of my job actually filling those jobs, so I kind of know from a technology standpoint that it's going to be. I'm just really fascinated about what's going to happen next. You got all this talent, bright people, not necessarily in corporate structures, doing the unnecessary for the ungrateful. I'm just curious where it's going to go. I mean, what are we going to do with 90 million people that are underemployed or simply not pursuing work?
Well, just to add to that, we have the book by Tyler Cowen, and there's another book that says that as machines become more and more sophisticated, artificial intelligence comes along, you're going to have a small percentage of people whose talents complement those machines, and then there's everyone else who will be doing well, I don't even know if they'll be doing menial work because machines will be doing that. So they'll end up being, I don't know, coaches and, some kind of work that doesn't involve machines, but they won't be making a whole lot of money and they'll be pretty much stuck there. It's a pretty pessimistic.
But what does that say about the politics, though? Then, if that's the case, and there's more people that are consumers than producers, doesn't that make it a little bit easier to sell stuff they're going to give you for free?
Well, I don't know. I think more and more stuff will be free. I mean, look at all the stuff that's free on the internet.
Oh yeah.
Who would have thought that?
But
this being one of them.
Yeah,
I think
while the value of being free, that it just kind of, throws a monkey wrench in that, anything that's valuable must have some price associated with it, and everything has to go through the price system. Like everything is a good that some professionalized people produce and then ship off, and then you buy and then you consume. That once there are things that aren't kind of relics from the kind of pre-industrial economy, like, oh yeah, air is free, but who cares? It's just the air. Or like.
Well, to a large extent, free is an illusion. For example, with free software, what you need is support. And a lot of free software is supplemented with paid support, at least for the people who really need it. Mm-hmm. And this is what I think a lot of corporations found out when they decided they were going to leverage free software. Hey, you got to have people support that quote-unquote free thing. Mm-hmm. And I think, there's no such thing as a free lunch, obviously, comes to mind. Well, apparently there are things that people give you because they want you to have it. The other philosophy, I think, is if something is free, if a product is free, you're the product. And you can apply that to Google and practically every information service.
Sure,
so
free, but you personally are still getting utility.
Oh, yeah,
for free.
But free in maybe some high percentage, like 80 to 90% of free, is actually not free. And then maybe some portion of free probably is.
The thing is that the economy really has become ephemeralized. Like the actual cost of producing like an iPhone is less than the total cost of just all the things it can do. Like, including the other people who are making it in those factories in China aren't being paid well. But even if they were paid, very well, kind of, even if they're being paid fairly, and all the kind of hidden costs related, it's still like an iPhone versus like a camera, a Walkman, video conferencing. Like once you add those things, like just the things get easier to, things cost less to make, because that just, like.
So does everybody go into so we're all part of the service economy now? Everybody's providing a service, somebody else will pay money to receive?
Well, that's a good point. I mean, with the government making it harder and harder to individually offer services without going through all the things that they're trying to keep you from doing from a corporate, if you want to look at it as a corporate stranglehold on government, from a corporate standpoint, then the service economy is really being, when that's all we have, it's being strangled, if you will.
Yeah.
And then people just have to hustle more and more and more just to, get by. Like just the endless thing of just trying to get, people to get your services, and just like it can be even more exhausting than working 9 to 5. Of just the constant uncertainty of whether and if there's zero support, and just any mechanism of kind of pooling resources, and to kind of cushion the periods of uncertainty and any forms of subsistence to kind of just directly produce subsistence good needs survivor just cut off, then it is very hard.
Well, listen, I need to adjourn this now. We're past the top of the hour, and I got to do some things. So I do very pleased that you all came out. It was a good discussion, and hope you'll check up and see what the next one's about. It'll be in the middle of next month. There'll be an announcement at the website. And good seeing everybody. Thanks again.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.